You can sit at a table full of people and still feel alone. Not because you hate them, not because you think you're above them, because you hear what isn't being said. A laugh that arrives half a second late, a compliment that lands like a leash, a silence that isn't empty, just guarded. Everyone is talking. But most of it is surface. Safe words, safe stories. Nothing that risks anything. And if you're the kind of person who notices, it doesn't feel neutral. It feels like being asked to participate in a soft lie. So you try once. You ask a deeper question, not dramatic, just real. Something about how people live online and feel alone. Something about how we perform connection. And the room closes, quietly. No argument, just a shift. Eyes move away. The topic changes. You're gently placed back where you belong. That's the first danger. Depth makes you a problem in rooms built for comfort. The second danger is slower. You start editing yourself while you speak. You learn which parts of you cause tension, so you reduce them. You shorten them, you hide them. Over time, you don't just feel misunderstood. You feel thinner, like you're surviving on a smaller version of yourself. And the third danger is the heaviest one. You become a witness. You see the fear beneath confidence. You see the need beneath cruelty. You see the avoidance beneath jokes. You don't get to unsee it. People call this overthinking, but it's not always thought. Sometimes it's awareness, a kind of contact with what's actually in the room. This isn't a romance about being special, it's a cost. And later, I'll show you one way this cost can be turned into something clean. But first, you need to see the trap clearly. Because if you don't name it, it names you. It usually starts early. You were the kind of child who asked one question too many. Not to be annoying, not to show off, just because you noticed something didn't add up. And you learned fast what happens when you don't accept the surface. A pause, a tight smile, a sentence meant to close the door. Don't think so much. Stop overanalyzing. Those words don't erase the questions, they bury them. So you grow up with depth kept private and caution kept public. You learn to edit yourself before you speak, not because you're weak, because you've watched what rooms do to people who don't play along. This isn't only personality. For some people, it's processing. Your mind doesn't skim, it goes down. You pick up subtleties other people miss. A shift in tone, a small hesitation, a contradiction between what is said and what is meant. That kind of perception has a cost. It keeps you awake inside. It makes simple conversations feel like puzzles. Nietzsche had a name for the person who breaks from the herd. A free spirit. It sounds heroic. But the price is not romantic. The price is distance, loneliness that doesn't come from being disliked. Loneliness that comes from not being able to unsee what you see. Then you meet the adult version of the same lesson. The workplace. A system built for speed, for efficiency, for agreement. You walk in looking for meaning, for integrity, for words that match reality. And you notice how often they don't. You notice the polite lies, the careful omissions, the meetings where everyone understands what's wrong and no one names it. So you do, or you want to. You point at the elephant. You refuse the double speak, and the room gets colder. Not loud, just colder. There's an old image that explains this. Plato's cave. People staring at shadows on a wall. One person steps out, sees the real world, and comes back. Not to dominate, to explain. But the group doesn't thank him. They protect the shadows. They don't call him brave. They call him dangerous. That's the pattern. When you move toward depth, you gain clarity, and you lose comfort. So your life becomes a quiet negotiation. How much you say, how much you hide, and how much truth you can carry without turning it into a performance. Picture a room where everyone agrees to stay comfortable. not because they are evil. Because comfort is a social currency, and most people spend it without thinking. You walk into that room and you feel the difference immediately, not in the words, in the air behind the words, the pauses, the polite laughter that arrives on time, the silence that arrives even faster. This is the central conflict. Society often runs on the frequency of comfort. You run on the frequency of truth. Comfort is smooth. It avoids edges. It keeps the conversation moving. Truth has edges. It stops the conversation. It asks for a price, and once you have touched something authentic, once you have tasted the weight of what is real, everything else begins to feel like performance. Not because you are superior, because you can hear the difference. People can live inside a script for years. They repeat the same phrases. They borrow their opinions. They smile at the right moments. They call it normal. Jung would tell you that much of this is unconscious. Most people do not meet what is underneath them. They learn what to say. They learn what to want. They learn what to ignore. And they do it so well that it becomes invisible to them. But you have made contact with what sits underneath. Not all of it, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to feel when a sentence is a shield. Enough to notice when a joke is used to hide fear. Enough to see that certain smiles are not joy. They are compliance. There is an old idea of a veil, a layer of appearances that makes life easier to carry. Many people live well inside that veil. They do not call it illusion. They call it peace. You have seen behind it, and that changes your relationship with everything. It is like learning the true name of something. After that, the old name sounds wrong, not immoral, just inaccurate. And accuracy becomes hard to compromise with. This is why you get labeled. Too intense, too serious, too negative. Because the moment you name what is real, you interrupt the agreement, you disturb the surface, you force people to feel what they were successfully avoiding. And they respond the way people often respond to disruption. They call you the disruption. Sometimes it is subtle. A glance, a change in tone, a quick pivot to safer topics. The invisible signal, don't go there. Other times it is direct. They tell you that you are overthinking, that you are making it heavier than it needs to be, that you should relax. But you are not making it heavier. You are refusing to pretend it is lighter. There is a simple story about this, a crowd admiring an emperor. Everyone praises the clothing that is not there, because the cost of seeing is higher than the cost of lying. Then one voice says what it sees, not to be heroic, not to humiliate, simply because it cannot say the opposite without losing itself. That voice becomes a problem, not because it is wrong, because it breaks the spell. And this is the loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, the loneliness of refusing collective denial. You can feel it when you sit with people and realize you are not sharing the same reality. They are sharing a performance. You are sharing observation. They want ease. You want meaning. They want to move past discomfort. You want to understand it. So you learn restraint. You learn timing. You learn to watch for the moment a room starts tightening, and you decide again and again whether you will speak or whether you will let the comfort win. But here is the cost. Every time you swallow what you see, you pay with a small piece of yourself. And if you do it long enough, you begin to forget what your own voice sounds like. So you have to hold two realities at once. One face turned toward the world as it is, the agreements, the rituals, the masks, and the other turned toward what you know to be real. Not to punish people with it, not to dominate, just to remain intact. That is the frequency problem. You are not chasing conflict. You are simply living with a signal you cannot turn off. And the more honest your perception becomes, the more carefully you must choose where you let it speak. Jung had a name for how this spreads. Psychological contagion. Emotions passing from person to person without permission, without language, as if the atmosphere itself is doing the speaking. Most people can ignore it, or they don't notice it at all. You notice. And the problem isn't only that you notice, you absorb. That is why your exhaustion can feel irrational. You can sleep and still wake up heavy. You can leave a conversation and feel as if you ran a long distance, even though you barely said anything. Because you weren't only listening, you were carrying. You were taking in the emotional weather of the room and storing it in your own chest. So you adapt. You develop a survival skill that looks like social ease, but it isn't ease, it's camouflage. You learn to read what each room wants and become it. Lighter, simpler, safer, less intense. A chameleon with good manners. And the more accurate you become at this, the more invisible you risk becoming to yourself. This creates the trap. You know, instinctively, that real connection requires depth. But you also know what happens when you show the full weight of your perception. Some people withdraw, some people label you, some people punish you softly, with distance, so you ration yourself. Not because you are dishonest, but because you have learned that honesty, in the wrong environment, can be a form of self-harm. The move is not to become less authentic. The move is to become discerning, to accept that some places cannot hold depth, no matter how gently you offer it, and that it is not your task to force a room to become larger than it is. The old Christian writers understood this kind of inner climate. They called it the dark night of the soul, a season where surface comfort stops working, where familiar distractions lose their power, and something truer begins to form in the quiet. Not as a performance, not as a badge, simply as a passage. And if you are in that passage, then the mask you built to survive may start to feel heavier than the loneliness it once protected you from. You become good at holding people, not because life rewarded you for it, because life trained you. When you've been misunderstood for long enough, you stop demanding to be understood. You start watching, listening, learning the weight behind words. That's how the wounded healer is formed, not as a title, as a pattern, a person who has been cut and therefore notices where others are bleeding. It looks like strength from the outside, but inside, it's often just sensitivity that never got to rest. You see what's left unsaid. You hear the tension under jokes. You can tell when someone is asking for help while pretending they don't need it. So people come to you, not because they know your inner life, because they feel you can carry theirs, and you can. That's the problem. A role forms around you, the calm one, the one who understands, the one who doesn't judge, the one who knows what to say, and slowly, without anyone deciding it out loud, you become a place that others visit. But a place is not a person. A place is used. A place is leaned on. A place is walked into and walked out of. If you don't notice this early, you start living as a function, not a self. You give without refueling. You listen without being listened to. You absorb without being emptied. And then you call it being helpful. You call it being mature. You call it being strong. But it's also a leak. The danger isn't that you care. The danger is that caring becomes a contract you never signed. Individuation, real individuation, is not becoming colder. It's becoming whole. It's integrating what you are, the sensitivity, the insight, the shadow, the part of you that gets tired, the part of you that resents being needed, the part of you that wants someone to hold you for once. You don't heal by deleting those parts. You heal by admitting they exist. Depth becomes a treasure only when it has edges. Without edges, depth becomes a drain. So the boundary principle is simple, not loud, not theatrical, just precise. Give without depleting. Love without losing yourself. It means you stop offering your whole nervous system as a public resource. It means you stop volunteering for emotional labor you didn't agree to. It means you learn to pause before you rescue. Not because people don't matter, because you matter too. And if you don't protect the thing that sees, it will eventually go numb. That's the final cost. Not pain, not loneliness, but numbness. So you don't become less compassionate. You become more honest. You stop pretending your depth is infinite. You stop pretending you don't have needs. You stop pretending your role is your identity. You stay capable, but you stop bleeding quietly. That's how the wounded healer becomes a healer. not by being endlessly available, by becoming whole enough to choose. Solitude and loneliness look similar from the outside, but they are not the same experience. Loneliness is not simply being alone. It is the feeling that you are misplaced in the presence of people, that you could speak plainly and still not be met. Solitude is different. Solitude is a room where you stop performing, a place where you are not translating yourself into smaller words, a place where you can hear what is yours and what you picked up from others. Because if you are this kind of person, you don't just notice a room, you carry it. You walk away with moods that weren't born in you, tension that entered through your attention, and later you call it my tiredness, when it was never fully yours. So solitude becomes a kind of sanctuary, not an escape, a clearing, a place where the borrowed emotional weather finally dissipates. And in that clearing, something else happens. You begin to separate rejection from identity. When you've been dismissed often enough, you start doing their work for them. You pre-edit yourself. You shorten your sentences. You hide your depth behind politeness, not because you are ashamed of it, because you learned what certain rooms do to it. Solitude is where that training loosens, not through grand declarations, through quiet recognition. You watch the old reflex arise, the impulse to explain, to soften, to make yourself acceptable. And instead, you let it pass. You don't chase the approval of people who can't perceive what you're offering. You don't throw your inner life into places that treat it as excess. This is the transmutation. Isolation becomes introspection. Rejection becomes selectivity. Desperation becomes a kind of discipline. And then the question appears, where are the people who can hold depth? They exist. But they are not loud, and they are not obvious, because many of them have also learned to hide. So finding them is not a hunt. It is patience. It is courage. It is the refusal to settle for conversations that cost you your own mind. There is a way you recognize them, not by big claims, by how they respond when you speak carefully. A shallow person hears a sentence and waits for their turn. A depth person asks a follow-up that shows they were actually there. They don't just react, they receive. This is a kind of emotional sonar. You don't force intimacy. You listen for it, you test for it, and you stop demanding that one person be everything. You build a network, not a crowd. Different connections for different parts of you. One person for quiet honesty, one for shared craft, one for thought, one for simple presence. Because the mistake is not needing people. The mistake is expecting depth from rooms that were built to avoid it. And this is why authenticity becomes a rebellion. Not as a performance, not as a slogan, as a private decision to live without begging for permission to be real. When the culture rewards insecurity and distraction, depth will always feel costly. But the cost of abandoning yourself is higher. So you choose your environments, you keep your standards, and you let solitude do its work. Subscribe, not out of habit. Do it if you recognize yourself here. If you don't, leave. This depth you carry is not a flaw, but it is dangerous when it has no discipline. Sensitivity without boundaries turns into slow self-erasure. You don't need to explain yourself to rooms built on denial. Not every space deserves your truth. Some places can only consume it. Learn restraint, not silence. Discernment. Know where depth is possible and where it will only be punished. Hold compassion for people who live on the surface, but do not sacrifice yourself to keep them comfortable. That bargain always ends the same way. Others like you exist. They are not loud. They are not obvious. They recognize you by precision, not performance. Do not dim what you see. Just choose carefully where you let it land.